6 men in matching black suits closed the circle around Sloane Ashford in the empty sublevel of a parking structure, cutting off every stairwell and blocking the only ramp to daylight, demanding she surrender a single encrypted phone that could bring down an entire empire built on her father's name. Nobody noticed the maintenance worker setting his tool bag down beside a battered sedan 2 rows away, because nobody ever noticed him. Miles Rowan did not shout. He did not reach for anything dramatic. He simply walked forward, looked the lead man directly in the eye, and said 4 quiet words to the trembling woman behind him. "Stand behind me." What none of them understood was that Miles had survived far worse rooms than this one, and he had never once needed to raise his voice to do it. If you believe real courage rarely announces itself, press subscribe now and stay close, because Miles Rowan is about to prove that some of the most dangerous men in the world are the ones nobody bothers to look at twice. Long before the sublevel and the 6 men in black, Miles Rowan's mornings began the same quiet way, in a kitchen too small for the life he used to imagine and exactly the right size for the one he had chosen instead. With coffee brewing while he packed a lunch for his daughter and laid out her clothes on the chair by the door, because she liked choosing her own outfit even when she was half asleep. He drove her to school in a car that had outlived 2 transmissions and 1 marriage, listened to her talk about a science project on magnets, and told her, as he told her every morning without fail, that he would see her after school no matter what the day tried to throw at him. Then he drove to Ashford Tower, badged in through the service entrance, and spent his day inside the walls of a company where senior executives walked past him in the elevator without a flicker of recognition, as though the man keeping their emergency exits functional and their fire doors sealed correctly did not exist at all. Miles had long since made peace with being invisible to people like that, because invisibility had its own kind of usefulness, and a man who is never watched has time to notice everything. That particular morning, while running a routine diagnostic on the fire suppression relays in sublevel 4, Miles found something that did not belong. A cluster of motion sensors near the loading corridor had been disabled through an administrative override, the kind normally reserved for construction crews or emergency drills, except no drill had been scheduled, and no construction permit existed for that section of the building. He filed the anomaly through the proper channel, attaching timestamps and access logs, and within the hour it came back closed, stamped with a note from the security department calling it routine maintenance interference. Miles had spent enough years reading reports written to make problems disappear that he recognized the language instantly, the careful blandness of a lie dressed up as paperwork, and he saved a copy for himself before the ticket vanished from the system entirely. Later that same afternoon, on his way to check a stairwell alarm near the executive suites, Miles passed an open corridor where Sloane Ashford stood arguing quietly with a tall, elegantly dressed man named Preston Carrington. Preston's voice never rose above a pleasant murmur, the kind reserved for people who had never needed to shout to get their way. But Miles watched his hand close around Sloane's wrist for one brief, deliberate second before releasing it, a gesture too small for most people to register as a threat and too precise to be anything else. Sloane pulled her arm free and walked off without a word, and Preston straightened his jacket as though nothing had happened at all. Miles said nothing and kept moving, because it was not his place to intervene in an argument between 2 people who clearly outranked him in every visible way, but he did not forget the coldness in Preston's expression or the heavy signet ring on his finger, engraved with a crest that looked less like decoration and more like a warning. That evening his phone buzzed with a call from Wren School, and for one panicked heartbeat Miles feared the worst, for he heard his daughter's voice on the other end, cheerful and a little nervous, asking whether he would really be able to make it to her weekend recital, or whether work would swallow him again the way it sometimes did. Miles promised her he would be there, told her he was already circling the date on the calendar in his head, and meant every word of it the way he meant every promise he had ever made to her since her mother died. Before he clocked out for the night walking the last checkpoint on his rounds, Miles noticed 6 temporary access badges had been activated for sublevel 4 under a vendor name that appeared nowhere in the building's approved contractor list, a detail so small that anyone else would have passed over it in the log without a second thought. But Miles had learned long ago that the smallest details were usually the ones worth remembering. Sloane Ashford had not slept properly in nearly 2 weeks, not since she first noticed the irregularities buried inside a stack of aviation component contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Purchase orders that traced back to a consulting firm indirectly controlled by the Carrington Family Trust. As the company's internal compliance counsel, she had access most employees never saw, and what she found kept her awake long after the office emptied out each night, lines of testing data that had been quietly altered so that parts failing safety thresholds were certified anyway and shipped to airline clients who trusted the Ashford name completely. Every signature at the bottom of every falsified report eventually led back to the same small circle of executives, and every trail of internal emails she recovered pointed to instructions from Preston Carrington and Security Director Warren Blackwood to erase the original testing files before an audit could uncover them. Sloan knew exactly what discovery would mean if it ever became public: criminal exposure for Preston, catastrophic liability for the company her grandfather had built from nothing, and very possibly the collapse of thousands of jobs that depended on Ashford Dynamics surviving its next fiscal quarter. She could not simply hand the evidence to her father, because Theodore Ashford was preparing, in a matter of days, to grant Preston an expanded block of voting authority on the board, convinced that Preston alone had the financial acumen to steer the company through a downturn that had already cost them 2 major contracts. Theodore trusted Preston the way a man trusts someone he has known since childhood, without questioning whether that trust had ever truly been earned, and Sloan understood that accusing him now, without airtight proof, would only make her look desperate and disloyal in her father's eyes. So she copied everything she had found onto a single encrypted phone, a device with no ties to the corporate network and no way for Warren's security team to trace it, and arranged a meeting for the following morning with a federal investigator she had known since law school, someone outside the company's reach entirely. What Sloan did not know was that Helena Winthrop, the board's chief counsel and Preston's most loyal fixer, had already flagged an unusual access pattern in the compliance database days earlier and quietly reported it upward. Preston did not order anyone hurt, not directly, not in words that could ever be traced back to him in a courtroom. He simply told Warren to retrieve the phone by whatever means necessary and to make certain Sloan understood, in no uncertain terms, exactly what happened to people who worked against the Carrington name. Sloan felt the first prickle of real fear the moment the elevator doors opened onto the parking sublevel, when she saw 6 men in matching black suits stepping out of 2 idling sport utility vehicles in perfect, practiced unison, moving with the kind of coordination that had nothing to do with ordinary corporate security. They spread out silently, sealing off the stairwell doors and the vehicle ramp before she had taken 3 steps out of the elevator, and the man in front, older and unmistakably in charge, said her full name, as though he had been waiting there for hours, simply to say it. His name was Conrad Whitlock, and he asked for the phone in a tone so calm it made the request feel almost reasonable, the kind of voice a person uses when they already believe they cannot possibly lose. Sloan told him the cameras were recording everything happening in that garage, hoping the bluff might buy her even a few seconds, but Conrad only smiled and told her the camera feed for that level had gone dark exactly 10 minutes earlier, a detail delivered with the ease of a man reading off a grocery list. Somewhere behind her, footsteps echoed against concrete, and Sloan realized with a cold, sinking certainty that whatever happened next in that garage, no one outside these 7 people would see a single frame of it. Miles had just finished testing a fire door 2 levels up when the emergency relay panel in his hand flickered with an unusual pattern, a full camera dropout on sublevel 4 that matched nothing in the scheduled maintenance log he carried in his back pocket. He rode the service elevator down without quite knowing why, some old instinct pulling harder than curiosity ever could, and stepped out into a corridor of parked cars just in time to see 6 men forming a deliberate perimeter around a woman he recognized instantly as Sloane Ashford. He noted, almost without thinking about it, the spacing between each man, the angle of their shoulders, the way 2 of them kept their hands loose and ready near their jackets, and he understood immediately that this was not a random robbery or a misunderstanding between security guards and a nervous executive. This was a professional extraction, executed by people who had studied the building's blind spots long before tonight. Miles set his tool bag down without hurry and walked forward, closing the distance between himself and the circle with the unhurried calm of a man who had done this kind of walking before in places far more dangerous than a parking garage in Riverton. Conrad Whitlock looked him over with open contempt, taking in the maintenance uniform and the badge clipped to his chest, and told him this was not a job for a man who fixed doors for a living. Miles said nothing to that. He simply stepped between Conrad and Sloan, angled his body so that her line of retreat toward the stairwell opened up behind him, and spoke 4 words in a voice so quiet that only she could hear them clearly. "Stand behind me." What followed lasted less than 90 seconds, though it would feel to Sloan like the longest 90 seconds of her life. Miles reached into his tool bag and triggered the fire door control he had serviced only hours earlier, sealing off 3 of the 6 men behind a heavy steel barrier before they understood what he was doing, and in the same motion he activated the emergency alarm relay, opening a direct audio line to the city fire department that could not be silenced from anywhere inside the building. When one man lunged to grab the phone from Sloan's hand, Miles caught his wrist mid-motion, twisted it just enough to break his grip without breaking anything else, and shoved him back into a parked vehicle hard enough to end the attempt, but gentle enough to leave no permanent damage behind. Another man drew a collapsible baton from his jacket, and for one heartbeat the entire garage seemed to hold its breath, until Conrad raised a hand and called for restraint, the blaring alarm overhead making clear that attention was already on its way and a fight now would cost them everything. The 6 men retreated to their vehicles with the same eerie coordination they had arrived with, tires screeching up the exit ramp seconds before the first patrol car turned into the structure below. Before he climbed into the second vehicle, Conrad paused, looked back at Miles across the empty garage, and said something that would echo in Miles's mind for days afterward, a quiet warning delivered without a trace of anger. "You just put your daughter in the middle of a war that was never yours to fight." Miles felt the words land somewhere deep and cold, because whoever these men were, they already knew about Wren, and that single fact terrified him more than the 6 of them combined ever could. Police arrived within minutes, but by then the garage held no weapons, no working camera footage, and no obvious proof that anything more than a disagreement had taken place. Warren Blackwood arrived shortly after, dressed as though he had been called from an important dinner rather than roused from bed, and calmly informed the responding officers that the 6 men were simply outside contractors sent to recover disputed company property, insisting that Miles had badly misread a routine situation and physically assaulted one of his own colleagues. Sloane tried to correct him, her voice shaking with adrenaline and disbelief, but Warren's version carried the smooth, practiced confidence of a man accustomed to being believed on sight, and the officers, faced with 2 conflicting accounts and no footage to settle it, simply took notes and moved on. Theodore Ashford arrived not long after in a convoy of black cars, visibly shaken at the thought of his only daughter cornered in a parking garage, yet somehow unable to let himself believe that Preston or Warren could have had anything to do with it. When Sloane told him through gritted teeth that a stranger named Miles Rowan had likely saved her life, Theodore offered Miles a curt thank you and immediately reached for his checkbook, as though gratitude and cash were interchangeable currencies. Miles declined the money without hesitation, and something about his refusal seemed to irritate Theodore more than it should have, as if a man turning down easy money for saving his daughter's life was somehow suspicious rather than simply decent. Helena Winthrop moved even faster than Warren had, drafting an internal memo before sunrise that painted Miles as a rogue employee who had exploited emergency building systems without authorization, causing damage and disrupting operations across 2 floors. By the following afternoon, Miles found himself suspended from duty pending an internal review, stripped of his badge and his access credentials while the investigation supposedly unfolded, though he already understood, with the weary clarity of a man who had watched institutions protect themselves before, exactly how that review would end. A grainy clip of traffic camera footage, edited to show only the moment Miles restrained one of the 6 men, began circulating through local news outlets under a headline that called him a maintenance worker with a violent military past who had lost control in a corporate garage. Wren saw the clip on a classmate's phone before Miles ever had the chance to explain it to her himself, and she came home that afternoon quieter than usual, sitting across from him at the kitchen table with a question that broke something in his chest. She asked, in the careful, too-old voice she sometimes used when she was trying not to cry, whether rich and powerful people could really just make the truth disappear whenever it was inconvenient for them. Miles told her the truth as gently as he could, that people with enough money and enough lawyers could bury a story for a while, could make it look like something it never was, but that burying a fact was not the same thing as changing what had actually happened, and sooner or later the difference between the two tended to matter. That night, long after Wren had fallen asleep, Miles walked outside to find his sedan sitting slightly askew in the driveway, its glove compartment hanging open and papers scattered across the passenger seat as though someone had searched it in a hurry. On the back seat sat a plain manila envelope, and inside it, without a note or a signature, was a single photograph of Wren leaving her school earlier that day, taken from a distance close enough to make the message unmistakable. Miles stood in the dark driveway for a long time after that, phone in one hand, heart pounding in a way it had not pounded in years, understanding that whatever line he had crossed by stepping into that garage, the people on the other side of it were now prepared to cross a far more dangerous one in return. 2 nights later, Sloane knocked quietly on Miles's front door, dressed down and hollow-eyed, and asked if she could come in for just a few minutes to explain herself properly. She admitted, sitting stiffly at his kitchen table, with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee she never drank, that the phone the 6 men had wanted was only a key, a way into a separate, better-hidden archive of the real evidence, and that she had never told the police the full truth of what was happening because she genuinely did not know which officers, if any, could be trusted once Warren's name entered the picture. Miles listened without interrupting, jaw tight, and when she finished he told her plainly that her silence had nearly gotten his daughter photographed by strangers outside her own school, and that he could not accept any more risk landing anywhere near Wren's life. Sloane apologized and meant it, laying out for him exactly how deep the rot inside Ashford Dynamics seemed to run. Warren controlling every camera and badge in the building, Helena controlling every lawyer who might otherwise ask uncomfortable questions, and Preston maintaining quiet relationships with city officials that made even local law enforcement feel like an unreliable option. Miles told her, more sharply than he intended, that she needed to leave, that he had already lost one person he loved, and would not gamble what remained of his family on someone else's corporate war. Neither of them noticed Wren standing in the hallway doorway until she spoke, her voice small but steady, saying that if they simply sent Sloane away, the men who had left that photograph on the back seat already knew exactly where their family lived anyway. The words landed on Miles like a splash of cold water, forcing him to see the situation from an angle he had been too frightened to consider, that walking away from Sloane's fight did nothing to make Wren safer, and might in fact leave them more exposed than standing and finishing what had already begun. He agreed to help Sloane, but only under 3 conditions he laid out without room for negotiation. She would tell him the complete unfiltered truth from that point forward. Every step they took together would remain strictly within the law, and Wren would be kept entirely outside the investigation. No exceptions, no compromises. Sloane agreed to all 3 without hesitation, visibly relieved to finally have someone willing to stand beside her instead of merely managing her. Before she left that night, Miles examined the photograph left in his car more closely, noting the faint metallic glint at the corner of the frame that matched the type of dashboard camera used in Ashford's own private security fleet. Reflected faintly in the school's front window glass, barely visible unless a person knew exactly where to look, was a small crest that matched the signet ring Miles had noticed on Preston Carrington's hand weeks earlier, and once he saw it, he could not unsee it. He asked Sloane quietly why a man with Preston's wealth and standing would risk so much simply to retrieve one phone, and she answered him with a heaviness that told him this went far beyond stolen data. "Because he isn't only stealing money," she said. "He's preparing to take the entire company out of my father's hands." The following afternoon, Sloane drove Miles across town to a modest brick house belonging to Naomi Beckett, a retired federal investigator who had worked alongside Miles years earlier during a chapter of his life he rarely discussed with anyone, including his own daughter. Over strong coffee in Naomi's cluttered kitchen, Sloane began piecing together a version of Miles she had never imagined existed behind the quiet maintenance uniform, a man who had once served as a threat assessment specialist, attached to a protective detail, trained to read danger the way other people read weather. After leaving that role, Miles had spent several years as an executive protection specialist for private clients, a career that ended abruptly the day he discovered his own employer using their security personnel to intimidate a witness scheduled to testify against them. Miles had reported what he found, and the report had cost him everything, blacklisting him from an entire industry built on discretion and loyalty rather than principle. Not long afterward, his wife had passed away following a long illness, and Miles had made the decision, in the raw exhaustion of grief, to leave that entire dangerous world behind and build something small and steady for Wren instead, something no client, no contract, and no corporate scandal could ever threaten again. He had not walked into that parking garage because some old warrior instinct had been waiting to reawaken. He had walked in because he could not stand by and watch 6 armed men close in on a single unarmed woman, and that, he told Sloane plainly, was the only kind of bravery he had ever really trusted in himself. Naomi pulled the license plates from the 2 vehicles Sloane had seen in the garage and traced them back to a firm called Crown Dominion Security, a company registered at an address quietly owned through a trust connected to the Carrington family. Before she could forward the registration records to anyone at the federal level, her own investigative accounts locked her out without explanation, and years of archived search history vanished from the system overnight, a level of access only someone deep inside a major institution could have arranged. Within a day, Helena Winthrop filed a formal complaint, accusing Miles of unauthorized access to corporate data systems, a charge dressed up in legal language but unmistakable in its purpose. Proof that Preston already knew Miles and Sloane were digging into places he had never intended anyone to look. Digging further into archived personnel files that Warren's people had somehow overlooked, Naomi found a name buried inside old Crown Dominion payroll records that made the entire picture snap sharply into focus. Conrad Whitlock had served as Preston Carrington's personal security detail for more than a decade before ever forming his own private firm, a relationship far too close and far too long to be coincidence, and far too dangerous for either Miles or Sloane to underestimate any longer. Sloane needed one more piece before any of this became provable in a courtroom rather than merely believable in a kitchen. A copy of the building's raw server logs proving exactly who had disabled the cameras on sub-level 4 the night of the ambush. That data lived only inside Ashford Tower's central server room, and worse, it would be automatically overwritten at midnight as part of a routine data cycle, leaving them a single narrow window to retrieve it before the evidence erased itself forever. Miles argued hard against returning to the building at all, certain that walking back into Warren's territory was exactly the kind of risk he had promised to avoid. But Sloane reminded him, quietly and without cruelty, that without those logs neither of them would ever be able to prove what had truly happened in that garage. They entered through a service door using an old access badge Sloane still carried from her early years at the company, and almost immediately Miles sensed something wrong in the pattern of hallway lighting. A subtle rhythm that told him the building's monitoring systems had already been configured to track their exact movement the moment they stepped inside. Warren, alerted within minutes, deployed security personnel to seal off entire floors, but Miles refused to meet any of them head-on, instead relying on years of intimate knowledge about the tower's fire stairwells, service corridors, and elevator override codes to keep them a full step ahead of every team sent to intercept them. In the central server room, Sloane finally located the log entry she needed, a clean, undeniable timestamp showing Warren Blackwood personally disabling the sub-level 4 cameras less than 15 minutes before the ambush began. Buried in the same directory, she also found 6 temporary access credentials approved directly by Preston Carrington under a classified internal project labeled Continuity, the very badges Miles had noticed activated on the night before the attack. Cornered momentarily inside the machine room as security teams closed in from 2 directions, Miles and Sloane both flinched when the internal phone line on the wall began to ring, and Sloane, against every instinct telling her not to, answered it. Preston's voice came through smooth and unhurried, offering to erase every accusation against Miles and hand him $2 million in exchange for Sloane and the data she carried, an offer delivered as casually as a lunch invitation. Miles quietly recorded the entire call on his phone, though Preston, careful as always, never once said anything that amounted to a direct confession of wrongdoing. Using a maintenance stairwell Miles had serviced dozens of times before, the 2 of them slipped out of the tower minutes before local police, summoned by Helena herself, swept through the very hallway they had just vacated. Huddled together in the dim stairwell landing while they waited for the search teams above to move on, Sloane admitted quietly that she had spent her whole life believing money was the thing that kept a family safe, and Miles told her, just as quietly, that money could buy plenty of locks, but it could never guarantee that the person holding the key was actually someone worth trusting. Back at Naomi's house, reviewing the stolen files by lamplight, Sloane opened the folder labeled Continuity and found waiting inside it a fully drafted legal declaration ready for signature, one that would formally declare Theodore Ashford mentally and professionally unfit to continue leading the company he had built, transferring full control directly into Preston Carrington's hands. Sloane brought everything she had, the falsified contracts, the server logs, the continuity declaration, straight to her father the following morning, warning him plainly that Preston was preparing to seize control of the company through a coordinated boardroom maneuver. Theodore listened with visible impatience, convinced his daughter's accusations grew from resentment at being excluded from succession discussions rather than from any genuine evidence, especially after Preston and Helena had already presented him, days earlier, with a carefully forged file suggesting Sloane herself had accessed the CEO's private accounts without authorization. Preston, when confronted directly in Theodore's office, responded with practiced calm, gently suggesting that Sloane be placed on temporary leave for her own well-being, a suggestion delivered with such convincing concern that it only deepened Theodore's trust in him rather than shaking it. When Miles arrived to corroborate Sloane's account in person, Theodore dismissed him almost instantly, unwilling to give any weight to the word of an unemployed maintenance technician who, in his mind, seemed far too eager to insert himself into a wealthy family's private affairs, for reasons Theodore assumed were financial. Miles said nothing in his own defense except to place, silently, the untouched check Theodore had once offered him back on the desk between them, proof that money had never been the reason he stepped into that garage or any room since. Theodore still ordered security to escort him from the property, and as Miles walked toward the gate he noticed Conrad Whitlock speaking quietly with Warren near a side entrance, their body language relaxed and familiar, a small detail that told Miles the ambush in the garage had never simply been about retrieving one phone. It had been a test, he realized, a way to measure exactly how the Ashford family's security would respond before a much larger operation began. Sloane chose to leave the estate that same evening alongside Miles rather than stay and continue defending herself to a father who refused to listen. And Theodore, furious and wounded in equal measure, warned her that walking out that door would cost her every share of voting power she still held in the company. Sloane walked out anyway because whatever the cost, she had already decided she would rather stand on the side of the truth than remain comfortable inside a lie built to protect people who did not deserve her loyalty. Almost the moment they left the property, Theodore received formal notice that the board of directors had scheduled an emergency session for the following morning, one meant to determine, once and for all, whether he remained fit to continue leading the company that carried his family's name. Among the 6 men who had cornered Sloane in the garage, one named Dean Lockwood had begun to feel a weight in his conscience that would not let him sleep, unaware until later that the assignment had connected him to a scheme involving faulty aircraft components that had already put real lives at stake. After the failed ambush, Warren had summoned the entire team and demanded they sign statements claiming Miles had attacked them without provocation. And when Dean refused, quietly but firmly, the pressure applied against him grew sharp enough to frighten even a man who had spent years working dangerous jobs without flinching. Rather than sign a lie he knew would help bury the truth even deeper, Dean reached out to Miles through Naomi's old contacts, offering him a recorded copy of the planning meeting held before the garage operation, one in which Warren could be heard clearly instructing the team to retrieve the phone and to make certain Sloane understood the consequences of defying the Carrington family. The recording alone was not enough to charge Preston directly, since his own voice never appeared on it, and Warren had structured every instruction carefully enough to leave himself just enough deniability. But Dean offered something else almost as valuable. Knowledge that Preston intended to force the final vote for control of the company during an upcoming gala celebrating the firm's anniversary, an event where every major shareholder would be gathered under one roof. Miles built a plan around evidence rather than confrontation, trusting Naomi to deliver everything gathered directly to a federal investigator with no ties to Ashford Dynamics, while Dean agreed to appear in person as a witness willing to speak plainly about what he had seen and been asked to do. Sloane, meanwhile, prepared to exercise her remaining rights as a shareholder to demand a public hearing at the very gala Preston intended to use for his own coronation. While their plan came together, Helena moved just as quickly on her own front, filing a fresh warrant application accusing Miles of stealing corporate trade secrets, a charge built almost entirely on manufactured evidence but dangerous enough to threaten his freedom regardless of its truth. Determined to keep his daughter as far removed from the growing danger as possible, Miles brought Wren to stay with Naomi for a few days, trusting her more than almost anyone else he knew to keep his child safe while the situation unfolded. Before he left that evening, Wren asked her father, in the quiet, direct way only a child can manage, whether he was scared of what might happen next, and Miles, unwilling to lie to her even to spare her worry, admitted that he was more scared than he had been in a very long time. He told her, kneeling down so their eyes were level, that being afraid had never once decided whether a person ran away or stood their ground, and that the choice to stay and finish something important always belonged to the person feeling that fear, not the fear itself. Later that same night, sifting through old case files at Naomi's kitchen table, Naomi discovered something that made her go completely still. That the fresh warrant against Miles carried a signature belonging to Theodore Ashford himself, despite Theodore never having seen, let alone approved, any such document. The anniversary gala unfolded inside a glittering ballroom, filled with investors, board members, city officials, and a small army of reporters eager to document what Ashford Dynamics billed as a celebration of decades of aviation innovation. Preston took the stage early in the evening, his voice smooth and confident, informing the assembled crowd that Theodore Ashford could no longer be trusted to lead the company through its current crisis, and presenting his own leadership as an act of loyal rescue rather than ambition. Sloane walked through the ballroom doors before he finished speaking, invoking her rights as a shareholder to be heard, and Preston, without missing a beat, signaled Warren to have her quietly removed from the room before she could say another word. Miles stepped through the doorway directly behind her, and within seconds Helena's officers moved to arrest him under the fabricated warrant she had filed days earlier. Miles did not resist, offering no struggle at all, only asking calmly that the officers contact the federal investigator Naomi had already briefed, who confirmed within minutes that the warrant rested entirely on a forged signature and could not legally stand. Dean Lockwood stepped forward from the edge of the crowd at that exact moment, confirming publicly, in front of stunned board members and cameras alike, that Warren Blackwood had personally organized and directed the 6 men who cornered Sloane in the parking garage. Sloan projected the recovered server logs onto the ballroom's main screen, showing the precise timestamp of Warren disabling the sub-level cameras, while Naomi laid out documented financial transfers running directly from a Carrington family trust to Crown Dominion Security. The final blow came when Miles played the recorded phone call from the night in the server room, Preston's own voice offering $2 million in exchange for Sloan and the stolen data. And when Preston tried to dismiss the recording as fabricated, Theodore stood slowly from his seat and confirmed, in front of the entire room, that he recognized a private phrase Preston always used, one he had heard the man say 100 times over the years and could never mistake for anyone else's voice. Warren attempted to slip quietly toward a side exit as the room erupted into noise, only to find federal agents already waiting there, while Helena, realizing Preston had prepared documents all along to shift every ounce of blame onto her alone, made the sudden, desperate decision to cooperate fully with investigators rather than fall with him. The man who had once looked at Miles with open contempt, calling him nothing more than a fixer of doors, found himself undone entirely by the digital record of the very doors and cameras Miles had spent years quietly maintaining, a small, satisfying irony that no one in that ballroom failed to notice. In the weeks that followed, Preston, Warren, and several of their closest collaborators faced formal charges spanning coercion, evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and corporate fraud on a scale large enough to draw national attention. Theodore retained his position as chief executive, though only under the watch of a newly formed independent oversight committee designed to prevent any single person from wielding unchecked power inside the company again. He arrived at Miles's home one evening without a driver, without lawyers, and without a single member of his usual entourage, standing awkwardly on the small front porch until Miles invited him inside. Theodore admitted, in a voice stripped of all its usual authority, that his greatest failure had never really been trusting Preston too much, but rather trusting his own daughter too little, blinded by a lifetime of believing he alone could control every outcome around him. He apologized to Miles directly, acknowledging that he had once tried to measure a stranger's character by the size of a check, and that the refusal of that check should have told him everything he needed to know from the very beginning. Theodore then offered Miles a formal position overseeing safety and personnel protection across the entire company, a role built specifically around the instincts that had once saved his daughter's life in a parking garage nobody else had thought to walk into. Miles did not accept immediately, laying out instead 3 conditions he considered non-negotiable. An independent body would oversee the security division going forward. Employees would be guaranteed the right to report wrongdoing without fear of retaliation, and his schedule would always leave room for the moments that mattered most in his daughter's life. Theodore agreed to every condition without argument, and Sloan, for her part, was named the company's first fully independent compliance director, a role reporting to the new oversight committee rather than to her father at all. Before Theodore left that night, Sloan thanked Miles quietly for stepping between her and 6 armed strangers on a night when almost anyone else would have kept walking. Miles told her the real courage that night had never belonged to him, that true bravery belonged to the woman who had chosen, again and again, to stand up against the very empire built by her own family, rather than simply enjoy its comfort. 6 months later, Ashford Dynamics publicly announced a sweeping whistleblower protection program alongside a full voluntary recall of every substandard component tied to the falsified contracts, addressing the danger before it could ever reach the passengers who trusted the company's name. Miles still drove the same worn sedan to work every morning, still packed Wren's lunch before school, and still made a point of walking her to the door himself even now that his job title carried far more weight than it once had. He arrived early to the recital he had promised months earlier never to miss, sliding into a seat near the front just as the lights dimmed, and looked back once to see Sloan and Theodore sitting together a few rows behind him, present not as a chief executive and his director but simply as people who had earned a place in the Rowan family's small, ordinary joys. After the performance ended, Wren turned to Sloan with the blunt curiosity only a child could manage, and asked whether she was the one who had once stood behind her father on that frightening night in the garage. Sloan smiled and told her that yes, in the beginning, that had been exactly true, but somewhere along the way Miles had taught her how to stand on her own 2 feet as well. Neither Sloan nor Miles had rushed to put a name on whatever had grown quietly between them in the months since, choosing instead to build it slowly through simple dinners, unhurried conversations, and letting Wren pick the dessert every single time without complaint from either adult. As the 3 of them walked out toward the parking lot together, Wren ran ahead toward the car, and Sloan fell into step beside Miles, asking softly whether he ever regretted the choice he made that night in the garage, stepping between 6 dangerous strangers and a woman he had never even spoken to before. Miles looked at her for a long moment, something warm and certain in his expression, and told her that he never had, because sometimes all a person truly needed to know was that the one standing behind them was worth protecting. Sloane smiled, slipping her hand gently into his as they walked toward the waiting car, and told him softly that sometimes the person standing behind you turns out to be exactly the one who protects you right back. And together they walked forward into the ordinary, unguarded evening, leaving the city lights glowing quietly behind them.